Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Each week I receive messages, emails, and phone calls from kids, adults, parents, and friends of those and someone they know that has been diagnosed with autism. They are actively looking for work. They are desperate in many cases for work. So I thought it best to bring in an autism expert who can help us understand what it's like to look for a job when you have autism and maybe how we can help. Zach Zaborny is an international autism consultant, speaker, author, and autism self-advocate. Diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome at the age of 8, Zach went on to earn his bachelor's degree from my alma mater in mass communications, which is Kansas State University, in 2012. He has since made it his life mission to passionately communicate his lived experience with Asperger's to assist others. Zach worked with organizations around the world to promote autism awareness and educate employers about the benefits of employing individuals on the autism spectrum. Zach, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and yourself?
Sure. I was diagnosed with Asperger's when I was 8 years old. I was in third grade at the time, and my teacher came to my parents, came to my mother in particular, and she had a set of twins in the class the year before, and one of them was on the spectrum. And she said to my mother, "Zach may have Asperger's." And my mom said, "What is that?" And so she went home and she read a book by Dr. Tony Atwood, who is one of the premier Asperger's experts. He's a psychologist, and he's one of the premier Asperger's experts in the world. And she got through the introduction first page, and she turned to my dad and she goes, "Okay, this is it. This is Zach." And I was diagnosed shortly thereafter, and then went on to go to university, graduated from K-State in 2012. And then proceeded to have different career opportunities and did a variety of different jobs. And most recently spent 2 years living overseas in Australia, working for a nonprofit organization that specialized in assisting people with disabilities into employment. And I work specifically on a team that worked with people with autism, placing them into employment. And I'm back in the U.S. now, and I'm continuing the autism side of things, and in 2 weeks I'm starting a job with a nonprofit here in Phoenix. It's first of its kind in the country, and they're providing supportive housing for individuals with autism, and it's called First Place, and it's it's a first place for someone to live that has autism, and then eventually they move on and they will get their own independent place. But that's kind of where I'm at now in my life.
Zach, can you talk with us a little bit about autism and why it's an important conversation for you to have?
Why is autism important to me? That's a great question. So I guess the easiest thing is to kind of talk a little bit about why I ended up with the employment side. So when I graduated college, I had a math class my last semester that it was my second time taking this class. I failed it the first time, my sophomore year, and I took it my senior year to pass to graduate on time. I ended up passing the class, but because I was so focused on passing the class, the last few months of college, when everyone else was applying for jobs and had internships and was interviews, lined up and things like that, I hadn't applied to anything because my argument to my parents and the people around me was, well, what if I don't pass the class? I have to come back an extra semester, so I'm not going to graduate on time anyway. Why am I applying for jobs? And I ended up passing the class, graduating on time, but that, happened in the sense that I came out of school with nothing on my plate and no jobs or no interviews. And so I had the unemployment struggle for months after graduation. And when I moved to Australia, I realized that we were finding people that were, college age like myself. They were finishing school, and what was happening is that you were getting these individuals that were either finishing school and had no idea what they wanted to do, or didn't have the supports in place to really get into the places they wanted to get into or the paths they wanted. But alternatively, you had people that were so intelligent and so well educated, but they struggled in some, in the interview stages and little things that maybe neurotypicals will take for granted, that what happened was that you were getting people that were going back for second and third degrees, masters and doctorates, just to avoid having to go into the workforce. And for me, autism is such an important conversation because, as I tell parents all the time, if you're a parent of a child on the spectrum, 0 to 18 goes pretty quick. A majority of our life is spent not as 0 to 18, but as 18 to effectively when we die, which a large chunk of that includes employment, in whatever that looks like. And for me, it's important to have the conversation because it's about being able to show that not only is there hope, but also, it's about showing their supports, and there's areas for assistance for people that otherwise may not have gotten it, or that may have, gone into those holes of, oh, well, I have to get a second or third degree just to get into the workforce, or just to avoid the workforce. And I want to go out to people and say, no, if you just change, these little tiny things around, in your systems, or be it your universities, or be it your workplaces, you can change the whole system for the better.
I think that's an important point, that the adjustments, small changes that as employers we can make for the hiring process, as well as the workplace and the employment process, to make it more inclusive for everyone, whether it's autism or sight impairments, motor impairments, different ways of thinking, all those things, being more inclusive.
Yes, definitely.
So I connected with Zach, for those of you who are wondering, at South by Southwest, and we finally synced up to record this podcast. But I was intrigued because I've written quite a bit about and worked in the area of employing and providing accessibility and inclusion, particularly for people with disabilities. And I saw that Zach was going to be talking on the subject of autism here in Austin for South by. And then I also noticed that we graduated from the same university. So I had to pick up the phone or email, I guess, and connect with him. But let's talk a little bit more about autism hiring programs. And if someone, and there are a lot of employers who are maybe considering, or they've just started hiring people with disabilities, particularly in the area of autism, if they're hiring somebody who's diagnosed with autism, what are some of their unique skills and abilities?
Sure, and that's a great question. So first off, attention to detail. People on the autism spectrum tend to be black and white thinkers. We talk about people with autism seeing black and white and no gray, or as neurotypicals call it, rainbow. And so they talk about rainbow thinking, and that's a neurotypical. But people with autism, they tend to think with logic. Individuals that are neurotypical tend to think with emotion. And so answers tend to be more direct, more straightforward. And that goes for, the workplace, that goes for social, that goes for all kinds of things. In addition to the detail, you're also going to get someone that potentially, not always, but potentially can actually be more loyal. Oftentimes you'll find you have someone with autism that, due to maybe struggles in the past, be it socially, be it employment, be it fitting in a workplace, that once you get into meaningful employment, you're in a supportive employment environment that suits you, you won't leave. I sort of joke with people in the workplace and say that I'm a bit like a dog or a favorite pet, in that, you've got me, once you get me into your organization and you put me in the right place, I'm like a dog and I'm loyal and I won't leave you.
Loyalty is a quality, it sounds like, huh?
Definitely.
Can you maybe give us an example? Because you talked about like the black and white thinking. Can you give us an example, maybe in your recent history or life, where you've thought that way and others have not, maybe in a work context?
Sure. Perfect example. So when I was overseas in Australia, and even now, in some of the work I do now, I'm schedule based, and I operate. I sort of joke with people in the schedule based sense, in that a lot of people in the workplace tend to be spontaneous with meetings or things like that. And I sort of joke and I tell people, okay, you're the US. You tend to think, you want that instant gratification. You're now, I'm China. I think, months ahead. I think bounds and leaps ahead. I think about step number 10 through 15 when you're thinking about step 1, 2, and 3. That, goes into, when I lived in Australia, I traveled a lot. I was on the road 2 or 3 times a month, and it became, with my Outlook calendar, I had 8 different color codes for, was it a meeting? Was it an airplane flight? Was it a speaking engagement? Was it was it a networking event? And that was something that was black and white. That was when we traveled, I wanted my boss to tell me not only what flight were we on, but what time are we leaving to go to the airport? What time are we getting to where we're going? What hotel are we staying at? Do they have a buffet breakfast? How close are we to the metro station? That sort of thing. Whereas you'd have maybe an NT who would do something like that, and they'd go, all right, what time do I need to be, at the airport? And, when are we coming home? And for me, it was about, I wanted the nuanced details. And it's the same thing now in work and with traveling and employment. It's even through the processes of a hiring process, it's become, all right, when am I going to get, the next step? Who will I hear from? When will I hear from them? That sort of thing.
I think you bring up an interesting point here, because typically the hiring process is really open-ended and there isn't often a lot of feedback. And it sounds like, based on what you've shared, that can cause a lot of maybe anxiety and stress or uncertainty.
Oh, definitely. I can tell you for jobs I've been in the past, I know, for instance, when I moved to Australia, obviously that was an international move. So that was a multi-step process. There were multiple Skype interviews, and then there was the job offer. And then on top of that, there was the visa process, having to apply for a work visa and go through, not only our government, but the Australian government, and get through visa processes and housing. And there were lots of different things. And I remember a lot of the phone calls and the emails I had in the setup process to that job were, who's my contact? When am I going to hear from them? What's the time frame? Who do I go to if I have questions? Who's a backup person I go to if I have questions? That sort of thing. And I make that a point in interviews even now. If I'm sitting in an interview, whenever they say, oh, do you have future questions? I always go, well, yeah, what are steps 2, 3, and 5 in the hiring process? What does this look like? Who will I hear from? Who's my point of contact? And by the way, if you're not available, who's my secondary point of contact?
I think these are good things for you to share, because I would think potentially maybe some folks listening in, if they were maybe doing a first interview with someone and didn't maybe understand the reasoning for the questions, or the answers behind that, they might take it as somebody being pushy or aggressive, or they're sort of a miscommunication.
Sure.
Let's talk a little bit more about autism hiring trends. So you are right at the forefront of this. You're an expert leader talking about these topics, helping employers be able to understand and work with and employ people with disabilities in the area of autism. What are some ways or some trends that you've noticed that are happening in this space?
I think the number one thing is the inclusivity in the global workplace. I think that you're seeing, large corporations, you're seeing, Microsoft, you're seeing SAP, you're seeing, some of these bigger organizations going in and saying, all right, we're not only going to employ people with autism, but we're going to create a whole hiring practice around this. We're going to create a group of people that are going to head up this new project to allow an entire, subset of our business or our industry to work specifically on autism hiring practices. And, you saw that at the bigger level with some of these players. And now you're seeing it trickle down to, some of the smaller players on the space. And, even, it's a bit slower, but even local business, you're slowly starting to see local independent business do the same thing.
What are some ways that you think are working, that maybe you're seeing of some of these employers? They could be some of them that you mentioned, like Microsoft and SAP, which have really strong programs, but maybe some things that are working for some of these small independent organizations.
Sure. I know, for instance, locally here, for instance, in Arizona, we do a bit with they do a bit of social enterprise. And for instance, one of the social enterprises that they had going with the local autism charity was called Beneficial Beans. And what that was that was a coffee shop that was run out of one of the branches of the local library, and it was staffed by individuals on the spectrum. And the food that they served in the coffee shop, muffins and things like that, were sourced from farms, independent, little farms here in the city that were also staffed and tended to by people with autism. At the local level, you're seeing a lot more social enterprise, and obviously with things, like First Place that the organization I'm about to go in with, they have this subset called the Transition Academy, and from what I've understood from my knowledge is that it's an opportunity for people to learn, some of those employment skills and some of those life skills, and it's kind of an introduction, if you will, to some of those things that 10 or 15 years ago, even 5 years ago, were not as much on the radar.
You mentioned that, so you're seeing companies being more open and being more intentional of their hiring processes or their practices in the area of people with autism.
Yes.
Let's take a bit of a reset here. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast. Today we're talking about autism hiring programs with Zach Zaborny. You can connect with Zach on Twitter at Zach Zaborny, ZACHZABORNY.
Can you talk about some of your work that you provide in the areas of autism consulting, maybe with employers, and then we can kind of step back and maybe talk about some of the work that you've done in the past with job seekers or folks who have autism who are looking for work. So we'll start with employers first.
Sure. So actually just would have been 2 months ago. So I went to Central Europe, and I was in Slovakia for a week. And I was paired up with my former employer, and they had an office in Bratislava, Slovakia. And we ran a staff training with disability awareness. And I presented the autism side to their staff. And in addition, we had events at the local university with students that were looking to go into, NGO nonprofit work. And I talked about my experiences. And another event we had was a business breakfast with Slovakian business leaders. And I got up and I talked about being on the spectrum and my experiences and, my employment journey and skills and strengths. And this is a country where, this is a former communist country. So, 30 years ago, Slovakia itself didn't exist. And this is a country where disability is still kind of new to the table, being recognized on a governmental sense and on a more public sense, and especially things like autism, mental health as well. Those are things that traditionally in those environments haven't been addressed in their history and are now kind of starting to come to the forefront. You're seeing a lot more with social enterprise, and you're seeing a lot more with mental health and autism and invisible disability. And that sort of thing. And so to be able to go over there and do that was really nice, because I was able to provide insight to people that even though they maybe heard of what autism was, their knowledge wasn't maybe as it would be in, Australia or the UK or in the United States. There's still a lot more to learn. And in addition, I work with my not-for-profit that I worked with in Australia. I still consult with them. And even here in the States, it's the same. Oftentimes, I'll have people come up to me, either business, I'll have meetings or business leaders come up to me and say, hey, I've got a son or daughter on the spectrum. What advice would you give? My son or daughter is about to graduate college, or my son or daughter is about to graduate, high school. What do you suggest? Or what do I do as a parent? What suggestions do you have? So it really kind of runs the gamut on the consultancy.
So what kind of suggestions do you have in that instance?
Sure. So I was at an event last month, and the parent was in the audience and said, my son, he's on the spectrum. He's graduating college in, a month. What do we do to, foster his passions? And I said, well, as a parent, the most important thing you can do is learn what they're interested in, learn what their special interest is, or learn what they really want to do and take an interest in that. And I tell parents, I see, even if it's something that you're not familiar with, or you think, it's something that, I don't know anything about this, or, how can I possibly be interested in this? Even if it's baby steps, go to the bookstore and get a book on the topic, or, Google, whatever the interest is, and take an interest, even if it's for a little while, in whatever their interest is, because it's important as a parent to be there for your child, even if, they are, 22, 23 and they're graduating college. It's important to still show that, attention to what it is they're interested in. And because what that'll do is then that'll in turn say, okay, well, to them, that'll go, okay, this is someone that, is interested in what I'm interested in, and they want to help me, and they're passionate and I'm passionate, and it just sort of grows from there.
What advice do you have for someone who is just graduating from college and maybe they have Asperger's or autism? How do they go out into the world and find that right employer, place to work that they want to spend and invest their time?
Sure. I think the first thing is to, obviously, as I say, people on the spectrum, we tend to be detail-oriented, we tend to be planners, we tend to be, schedule-driven, we tend to be black and white. So most instances, if you're graduating, when you're graduating. So for instance, say you're graduating in May, I say, in January, start planning, do research, or talk to a trusted, talk to a parent, talk to a friend, talk to a career advisor, talk to a professor, and say, these are my passions. What can I do?
I think that managers have such an impact on the success of employees, including those with autism. What are some ways that you can suggest for managers to help make work environments more welcome and inclusive for the autistic employee?
The very first thing I can suggest is talk to your employee before they start, and then talk to them again when they start, and then talk to them throughout their tenure. When I moved to Australia, the first question I was asked during my interview, actually one of the last question, if you will, the very last question I was asked during the interview, right before I accepted the job, was, what supports or accommodations can we give you or do you need in the workplace? I was asked that question again on my first day, and I was asked that question again after my first week, and my boss asked that question to me several times throughout my tenure. If he saw I was struggling with something or I needed help, it was, how can we help you? I think that's the number one thing that employers can do. And I think it's, I can't stress enough the importance of doing that early on, and even during an interview, before you offer the job, or even once you've offered the job, before the person starts. Even though you're only going into day one, that's still day one where you're flying a little bit blind. And so it's important to, I think that's, I think that's tip number one. I think tip number two is be flexible. Understand that for individuals on the spectrum, we may, for tasks, we may take a little bit longer. We may look at things a different way. We may do different steps than what you told us to do, but that doesn't mean that we didn't understand what you said or what you want us to do. It's about, we may, look at a work task a little bit differently. We may see it differently. And it's about being able to, as a manager, be flexible and be open to different ways of interpretation, and accept that, if the work is getting done on time and it's being done how it's supposed to be and the end result is good, maybe don't always stress about, how did you get from point A to point B? What matters is that you got to point B, you completed the project on time, and you did what was asked. The A to B doesn't always have to matter.
So talk to your employees, which I think is a good one,
Yes.
and ask what kind of support can I give you to be successful, or
Yeah.
how can I help you, and to be flexible, because people think differently, they do differently. And I think that's just
Yes.
good management in general. Like, a good leader understands that each employee is different and unique, and they have to figure out how to use those individual talents to bring the team together.
Exactly.
One of the areas that, and one of the reasons that I have continued and kind of started on this path to talk about autism hiring programs is because I have a friend, and her son is diagnosed with autism, and I ended up working with a startup here in Austin that was focused on providing resources for children with disabilities and their support for their parents. and family members and caretakers. And so I realized quickly that there isn't a lot of resources and support that exist for those kids that then become adults and want to go out into the working world and be a part, as they should, whether it's having a job or just being able to live their lives.
Yeah, and we see that. I've seen that around the world. I've seen that, and the supports aren't always in place where you think they would be and when you think they would be. I said even the last 5 or 6 years since I've graduated, it's been less than a decade since I got out of school. And to me, in 6 years, I've seen amazing changes in workplaces and the environment and even society in the workplace that have, been an improvement, and we're continuing to improve. But I think it's one of those things that, the autism spectrum is in fact a spectrum, and they say that no two people on the spectrum are alike, which is true, and that the development of best practices in the workplace for people with autism are going to continue to grow and evolve and improve.
Well, I appreciate you doing your part to be a part of the conversation and helping educate employers, job seekers, all over the world. It's amazing, the things that you're doing. Where can people go to learn more about you and your work?
Sure. I'm active on social media, and then additionally, I have a website called the Zez Connection, ZEZ. It's my initials. So that covers a bit about some of the things I've done and some of the things I'm going to be doing with speaking engagements and advice and best practices and things like that.
In your travels, where was the most interesting place that you've been globally?
Globally, I would say Iceland. I went there on a whim and was somehow able to connect with the local autism charity. And I spoke to, and this was just sort of a sidebar of the trip, but I was able to speak to about 40 individuals that were parents of kids on the autism spectrum in Iceland. And Icelandic is a language that is kind of a language of its own, and I didn't speak, a word of it when I went over, and they speak, great English, so translation-wise, there are no issues. But even so, what I found was that it was such a different place as compared to anything I'd ever been. But what was interesting was after I talked, the parents came up, and the workers at the charity came up, and the questions that I was getting were the same questions I'd gotten in Australia, Slovakia, England, the USA. And it was interesting because I left the trip and I said to myself, it's amazing because what's, facing these parents and what's facing their kids are the same challenges people face around the world in all these different countries and these different environments. And, but for me, yeah, Iceland was unique. It was different. From what I understand, at one point, it was basically an active volcano thousands of years ago. So I was vacationing on what was at one point a giant volcano.
The last question I want to ask you, neurotypical. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like what that really means?
Sure. So neurotypical, or NT, is basically the autism community and the kind of I don't want to go out and say it's clinical because I don't believe it is. But neurotypical is basically the slightly more technical term that basically means people that aren't on the autism spectrum.
I just want to make sure that we kind of have, even if it's an official definition, I think it's important to kind of share the language and the terminology that you're using and your peers are using, because it might be being shared at the workplace. Thank you so much, Zach. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
It's clear from Zach's interview that autism is a global issue, and as employers, we have a real opportunity to give these skilled and detailed workers an employment opportunity. Maybe that's offering autism hiring programs and mentoring to graduates and their families. Or maybe it's creating an internship program at your company. Whatever it is, it's your responsibility, not just as businesses, but citizens of the world, to provide an opportunity for these members of the community. I love the work that Zach is doing, and I know from the outreach I've received on this topic that this is a huge area that employers can really make a difference and an impact. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill. Until next time, visit workology.com to listen to all our podcast episodes.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller-Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.